The hum of the jet engine is a promise of new destinations, of reunions, of escape. But for the 187 souls aboard Atlantic skies, Flight 815 from Chicago to London, that promise was about to be broken. One man's ugly prejudice directed at the very person holding their lives in his hands was just the beginning. They thought the drama was a racist passenger refusing to sit next to a black pilot. They were wrong. The real drama was waiting for them at 35,000 feet in the heart of a raging storm, where karma was preparing to make an emergency landing. The fluorescent lights of Chicago O'Hare International Airport's Terminal 5 hummed with a monotonous, indifferent drone, a sound that blended seamlessly with the frantic energy of 1,000 intersecting journeys. It was a cathedral of controlled chaos, a place where tearful goodbyes and joyous hellos played out against a backdrop of rolling suitcases and perpetual announcements. For most, it was a transient space, a necessary purgatory before the ascension into the clouds. For Mark Harrington, however, it was a stage, and he was, as always, its most important actor. At 54, Mark carried himself with the unshakable certainty of a man who had never been told no and truly believed it. His suit, a tailored charcoal gray piece by Tom Ford, was immaculate, a silent testament to a life spent in boardrooms where his voice was the only one that mattered. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his steel blue eyes held a look of perpetual assessment, a gaze that sorted the world into things that were useful to him and things that were not. He checked his Patek Philippe watch, a gesture of impatience more than a need for the time, and scanned the chaotic boarding line for Flight 815 to London Heathrow. He was flying first class, of course. To Mark, the world was a distinct hierarchy, and the velvet rope separating the privileged few from the general masses was a line he never waited behind. He strode past the long queue of economy passengers, a faint, almost imperceptible sneer playing on his lips as he observed their casual attire and oversized neck pillows. They were the background extras in the film of his life. "Good evening, sir," the gate agent. A cheerful young woman named Emily greeted him. Her smile was genuine, but it bounced off Mark's stoic facade like a pebble off a fortress wall. He handed her his passport and ticket without a word, his attention already drifting towards the jet bridge, towards the plush leather seat, and the pre-departure champagne that awaited him. He was on his way to close a multi-million-dollar acquisition, a deal that would solidify his legacy as a titan of the financial world. This flight was a mere formality, a necessary inconvenience. As he stepped onto the aircraft, the scent of recycled air and faint disinfectant greeted him. A flight attendant, a polished blonde woman in her late 40s named Catherine, welcomed him aboard with a practiced warmth. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Harrington. Your seat 1A is just to your right. May I take your coat?" Mark relinquished his cashmere overcoat, barely acknowledging her. His seat was perfect, a spacious pod at the very front of the cabin, offering privacy and a prime view. He settled in, accepting the offered glass of Bollinger with a curt nod. The small cabin began to fill with the other first-class passengers, a quiet Japanese couple, a tech mogul in a hoodie who looked barely out of his teens, and a British actress he vaguely recognized. They were his people, the ones who understood the unspoken rules of this elevated world. Everything was proceeding with the clockwork efficiency he demanded from life. The boarding process continued smoothly, the low murmur of conversation and the click of overhead bins forming a familiar symphony of departure. He was already mentally in London rehearsing his opening remarks for the big meeting when a new figure entered the first-class cabin, disrupting his carefully constructed mental space. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a crisp white pilot's shirt with 4 gold stripes on the epaulets signifying his rank as captain. He was impeccably dressed, his tie perfectly knotted, his black trousers sharply creased. He carried himself with an easy, confident authority. And he was black. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. He had flown hundreds of times, and while he'd seen black pilots before, it was still in his mind an anomaly. It didn't fit his internal picture of how the world was supposed to be structured. He watched as the pilot shared a brief professional word with Catherine before turning his attention to the empty seat directly adjacent to Mark's pod. It was the jump seat, a fold-down seat used by off-duty pilots, FAA inspectors, or in this case, a member of the flight crew during takeoff and landing if they needed to be in the cabin. It was positioned right by the cockpit door, a functional no-frills perch that was technically in the first-class zone, but not of it. The pilot whose name tag read Captain Anderson gave Mark a polite, professional nod. "Good evening," he said, his voice a calm, deep baritone. Mark offered a tight, almost imperceptible nod in return, then immediately turned his gaze out the window, a clear dismissal. He took a sip of his champagne, the cold liquid doing little to quell the flicker of irritation that had ignited within him. The pilot was sitting next to him, not in a passenger seat, but there in his immediate vicinity, an unwelcome intrusion into his personal space, his exclusive sanctuary. He could feel the man's presence, a quiet solidity that he found inexplicably aggravating. He tried to ignore it, to retreat back into his thoughts of mergers and acquisitions, but the pilot's proximity was a distraction. It was the principle of the thing. He had paid a small fortune for this seat, for the privilege of being insulated from the common rabble. And while this man was a captain, the visual just felt wrong. It was an unwelcome crack in the smooth veneer of his perfectly ordered world. The final passengers were trickling in. The ground crew was making their last checks. The hum of the auxiliary power unit would soon be replaced by the powerful whine of the Rolls-Royce engines. From the corner of his eye, Mark watched as Captain Anderson exchanged a few words with the first officer, a younger man who had just emerged from the cockpit. They spoke in low technical tones, their conversation a world away from Mark's. Catherine's voice cut through his thoughts. "Sir, we're just about ready to close the main door. Can I get you anything else before we push back?" Mark turned his cold gaze on her. Actually, he began his voice low and deliberate. "There is a problem." He glanced pointedly at Captain Anderson, who was now reviewing a flight manifest on a tablet. The unspoken message was clear. The storm was not in the skies. Not yet. It was brewing right there in Seat 1A, born from the unsettling calm of a prejudice as deep and as cold as the ocean they were about to cross. The final thump of the cabin door closing echoed with a sense of finality. The jet bridge retracted, and the world outside the small porthole began to slide away. For the passengers of Flight 815, the journey had begun. For Mark Harrington, the battle was just starting. He waited until the lead flight attendant, Catherine, had finished her pre-flight checks and was walking back towards the galley. He unbuckled his seatbelt with a decisive click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin and stood up, blocking her path. "Excuse me," he said, his voice laced with an authority that expected immediate compliance. Catherine stopped, her professional smile firmly in place, though a flicker of surprise registered in her eyes. "Mr. Harrington, is everything all right? Please, we need you to be seated for departure." "Everything is not all right." Mark stated, his gaze flicking with contempt towards Captain Anderson, who was now engrossed in his pre-flight checklist on his tablet. The pilot seemed oblivious, or perhaps was deliberately ignoring the brewing confrontation. I paid over $10,000 for this seat. I did not pay that kind of money to have to sit next to him. He didn't gesture. He didn't have to. The venom in his voice was a clear and ugly arrow aimed directly at the pilot. The quiet hum of the cabin seemed to dim. The Japanese couple in 2D and 2F paused their conversation, their heads turning slightly. The young tech mogul in 3A slowly pulled off his noise-canceling headphones. Catherine's smile faltered, replaced by a mask of cautious neutrality. She had been flying for 20 years and had dealt with every conceivable type of passenger, the drunk, the terrified, the entitled. She recognized the specific brand of arrogance radiating from Mark Harrington. It was the most dangerous kind, the kind that believed its own superiority was a law of nature. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping to a low, placating tone, "that is Captain Anderson. He is required to occupy the jump seat for takeoff per procedure on this flight. It's a non-revenue seat for crew members." "I don't care if he's the King of England." Mark shot back, his voice rising in volume, attracting more attention from the business-class cabin just behind the curtain. "His presence is unsettling. I find it unacceptable. I want you to move him." Captain Anderson finally looked up from his tablet. He didn't look angry or offended. His expression was one of mild curiosity, like a scientist observing a peculiar specimen. He met Mark's glare with a steady, unreadable gaze. That calm, that complete lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Mark even more. "Move the pilot." Catherine asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and forced politeness. "Sir, that's not possible. He is the captain of this aircraft." "Then move me," Mark demanded. "Find me another seat. I will not sit here." "Sir, the first-class cabin is completely full, and we are about to push back from the gate. I must insist you return to your seat and buckle your seatbelt." Her tone was still professional, but a steelier edge was creeping in. Mark scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "This is ridiculous. I am a platinum elite member with this airline. I have flown millions of miles. I have never been treated with such disrespect. I want to speak to the person in charge." A slow, deliberate smile touched Captain Anderson's lips. He carefully placed his tablet on the small ledge beside him and stood up. He was taller than Mark, and his presence seemed to fill the small space. The 4 gold stripes on his shoulders seemed to gleam under the cabin lights. "You're speaking to him," Captain Anderson said, his voice as calm and steady as a ship's anchor. The directness of the response seemed to momentarily stun Mark. He had expected the pilot to be a passive target of his complaint, not an active participant in the conversation. Now Mr. Harrington, the captain, continued, his tone patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a difficult child. "Miller is correct. We are on a tight schedule for our departure slot. I need you to return to your seat so we can get underway." Mark's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The public nature of the confrontation, his failure to immediately get his way, and the sheer audacity of this black man speaking to him with such authority pushed him over the edge. "You people are all the same," he sneered, the words slithering out thick with a lifetime of unexamined bigotry. "Given a little authority, and you think you own the world. I don't feel safe with you flying this plane. I want a different pilot." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby passengers. The tech mogul openly stared, his mouth agape. The British actress looked horrified. Catherine's face went pale with shock and fury. This had escalated from a complaint about seating to an outright racist attack on the captain's competence. Captain Anderson's calm finally broke, but not into anger. A profound look of disappointment, of weariness, settled over his features. He had heard variations of this poison before in flight school as a junior officer, in quiet, resentful looks from colleagues. but to have it thrown in his face so brazenly in front of his crew and passengers was a different kind of wound. He held up a hand to stop Catherine, who looked ready to intervene more forcefully. He looked directly at Mark, his eyes holding no malice, only a kind of sad clarity. "Sir, your feelings, whatever their basis, do not change the facts. The fact is, I am the captain of this aircraft. The fact is, we have a flight plan to London. And the fact is, federal aviation regulations require all passengers to comply with the instructions of the flight crew. You are currently in violation of those regulations." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "So you have two choices. You can sit down in seat 1A, fasten your seatbelt, and we can all continue with our day. Or you can deplane now, and we can discuss your concerns with our ground staff and airport security here in Chicago. The choice is yours, but you will make it in the next 30 seconds, or I will make it for you." There was no threat in his voice, only an unwavering statement of command. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Mark Harrington, the titan of finance, the man who moved markets with a phone call, was suddenly rendered powerless. He was used to issuing ultimatums, not receiving them. He glared at Captain Anderson, his mind racing. Deplaning would mean missing his meeting, a catastrophic outcome. It would mean humiliation, a story that could leak. The other passengers were staring at him, their faces a mixture of disgust and contempt. He had completely misjudged the situation, assuming his privilege was a universal currency. Here at 30,000 feet, it was worthless. With a final withering look of pure hatred, Mark Harrington spun around and fell back into his seat. He wrenched the seatbelt tight, yanking it with such force that the buckle slammed against the console. He folded his arms, turned his face to the window, and became a statue of simmering rage. Captain Anderson watched him for a moment, then gave Catherine a slight reassuring nod. He sat back down in the jump seat. The tension in the cabin remained a thick, unpleasant fog. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, their voices strained. The engine spooled up with a rising whine. Flight 815 was finally on its way, but it was carrying a volatile and poisonous cargo that had nothing to do with what was in the hold. The ascent was steep and smooth, a powerful climb through the bruised twilight sky over Lake Michigan. Below, the sprawling grid of Chicago's lights became a glittering, abstract carpet, shrinking with every passing second. Inside the cabin, however, the atmosphere remained heavy. Mark Harrington sat rigidly in his seat, his jaw clenched, radiating a palpable aura of fury. He had refused a drink, refused a hot towel, his only communication a series of hostile glares at any flight attendant who dared approach. The other first-class passengers tried to return to their own worlds, immersing themselves in movies or books, but the ugliness of the earlier scene lingered. Whispers were exchanged. Sympathetic, concerned glances were sent towards the cockpit door, which had closed shortly after takeoff. Captain Anderson had remained in the jump seat until the aircraft reached its initial cruising altitude of 10,000 feet. He had done so with a quiet, stoic professionalism, his focus entirely on his instruments and the familiar rhythms of departure. Then, with a final check and a nod to the cabin crew, he had unbuckled and disappeared through the armored door into the flight deck, leaving the cabin in the capable hands of his first officer, a sharp young pilot named Ben Carter, who was handling the communication for this leg of the journey. For the next hour, a semblance of routine settled over the plane. The dinner service began the clinking of cutlery and the gentle murmur of conversation, providing a fragile veneer of normalcy. Mark ate his filet mignon with a cold, mechanical precision, tasting none of it. Every rumble of the engines, every slight dip of the wings, fueled a paranoid narrative in his mind that the pilot was incompetent, that this flight was unsafe, that his initial prejudiced judgment was being validated by 1,000 imagined slights. He was trapped in a metal tube, his life in the hands of a man he had just viciously insulted. The irony was suffocating. Then, just as the dessert trolleys were being cleared away, the gentle bing of the cabin address system chimed. It wasn't the first officer's younger, higher-pitched voice that followed. It was the deep, resonant baritone of the captain. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Anderson, speaking from the flight deck." A hush fell over the cabin. Even the passengers in economy seemed to sense this was not a routine announcement about weather or arrival times. We are currently cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet, making good time on our way to London. The weather ahead is looking clear for the most part, and we're expecting a smooth ride for the next few hours. The team in the cabin will be dimming the lights shortly to allow you all to get some rest. He paused. Mark's head, which had been stubbornly turned towards the window, involuntarily swiveled a few degrees towards the nearest speaker. "I'm also speaking to you tonight." The captain continued, his voice losing its formal, almost robotic cadence and taking on a warmer, more personal tone, "because I want to address something. An event occurred during boarding tonight. An event that I'm sure many of you witnessed. It was an incident of disrespect, not just to a member of the crew, but to the very idea of what it means for us to share this space together." Mark's blood ran cold. He was being called out. In front of the entire plane. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrests. He braced for a direct, humiliating attack. But it never came. This aircraft, Captain Anderson said, his voice imbued with a quiet power, is a remarkable thing. It's a collection of millions of parts all working in concert to defy gravity. But it's more than that. For the next 7 hours, it is a community. We are 187 souls from different countries, different backgrounds, different walks of life, all heading in the same direction. We are entrusted with each other's well-being. My primary responsibility, my oath, is to the safety of every single person on this plane. But that safety isn't just about mechanics and weather. It's about creating an environment of mutual respect. The tech mogul in 3A had his laptop open, but was staring blankly at the screen, listening intently. Catherine and the other flight attendants stood, paused in the aisle, their faces turned upward. "I've been flying for 25 years, the captain went on. I've been privileged to see the world from a perspective few people get to see. I've watched the sun rise over the Himalayas and set over the Pacific. I've seen the patchwork of cities and the vast emptiness of deserts. And what you learn up here looking down is that the borders and divisions we create on the ground seem awfully small and insignificant. What you realize is that we're all just people." He took a slow breath. "Prejudice is a heavy baggage. It's a weight that serves no purpose, that clouds judgment, and that has no place on an aircraft or in our society. It presumes to know a person's worth based on the color of their skin, their gender, or their accent. I can tell you, after thousands of hours in the cockpit, the only things that matter in a crisis are skill training and character. Nothing else. The skin of the hand guiding the controls is irrelevant. What matters is the steadiness of that hand." Mark felt a strange, unwelcome prickle of shame. The captain's words were a masterclass in diplomacy. He wasn't naming names. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was elevating the conversation, turning an ugly personal insult into a lesson on shared humanity. In doing so, he was isolating Mark more completely than any direct accusation ever could. He was painting him not as an enemy, but as a fool, a man burdened by an ugly, pointless weight. "So tonight, I ask for your partnership," Captain Anderson concluded. "Let's make this small community, this metal tube hurtling through the night sky, a place of decency. Let's look out for one another. My crew and I will focus on getting you to London safely. All we ask is that you travel with kindness. Thank you for your attention. We'll speak to you again before our descent into Heathrow." The speaker clicked off. For a long moment, the cabin was utterly silent, the only sound the steady roar of the engines. Then something remarkable happened. It started in the business class section, a single person beginning to clap. Another joined in, and then another. The sound swelled a wave of applause rolling back through the curtains into the economy cabin, where passengers who had only heard the speech, not witnessed its cause, joined in anyway, recognizing the sincerity and strength in the pilot's message. It was an ovation for a man who had faced down raw bigotry, not with anger, but with grace and an unshakable sense of duty. Mark Harrington sat frozen in his seat, the sound of the applause washing over him like a physical force. It was a verdict. The entire plane had just passed judgment on him. He had never felt so small, so utterly alone in his entire life. He stared out the window into the endless inky blackness, a reflection of the void that had just opened up inside him. The flight was far from over, and a new, more terrifying thought began to form in his mind. He had not just insulted the pilot, he had made an enemy of the entire flight, and they were still hours from their destination. The applause eventually subsided, but the atmosphere in the cabin had fundamentally changed. The initial tension had dissolved, replaced by a sense of quiet solidarity. Passengers exchanged knowing looks and small smiles. The crew went about their duties with a renewed sense of pride and purpose. They were not just service workers, they were Captain Anderson's team. Mark Harrington, in his cocoon of self-imposed isolation, became a non-person. When a flight attendant offered him a refill of water, her voice was clipped and professional, devoid of the warmth she showed to others. He was a piece of cargo to be delivered, nothing more. For 2 hours, the flight was a picture of tranquility. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner soared through the darkness over the vast, unseen Atlantic, a tiny beacon of light and life in the immense void. Most passengers drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle vibrations of the aircraft and the dim, peaceful cabin. Mark could not sleep. The captain's words echoed in his mind, not because they had changed his heart, but because they had so thoroughly outmaneuvered him. He stewed in a bitter broth of resentment and humiliation. He mentally drafted complaints to the airline, fantasized about having the pilot fired, and planned the corporate takedown of anyone who had slighted him. It was how he solved all his problems with power money and intimidation. He was so lost in these vengeful reveries that he didn't at first notice the change. It was subtle, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through the fuselage. Then another, a little stronger. The gentle rocking motion that had been so soporific a few minutes ago became more erratic. The seatbelt sign chimed on with a sharp, insistent "bing, bing," and the cabin lights slowly brightened, waking the sleeping passengers with a collective groan. The first officer's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured, but with an underlying note of urgency. "Folks, this is First Officer Carter. We've hit an unexpected patch of turbulent air. We're going to ask everyone to please return to your seats immediately and make sure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Flight attendants, please secure the galley and take your seats." Turbulence was common on transatlantic flights. Most seasoned travelers barely registered it. But this was different. The shudders became violent jolts. The plane began to buck and sway, not like a boat on gentle waves, but like a toy in the hands of an angry giant. A loose glass in the galley crashed to the floor. A nervous scream came from the back of the plane. Mark gripped his armrests, his knuckles turning white. His heart began to pound against his ribs. He was a man who prided himself on control. Yet here, 7 miles above the earth, he had none. The aircraft suddenly dropped a sickening lurch that lifted everyone a few inches from their seats and sent stomachs into throats. A chorus of gasps and cries filled the cabin. Outside Mark's window, the serene, star-filled night had vanished. It was replaced by an impenetrable, churning blackness punctuated by blinding flashes of white light. Lightning. They had flown directly into the heart of a massive, unforecasted storm cell. The rain wasn't just falling, it was being hurled at the aircraft, striking the windows with the sound of gravel being thrown against a wall. Another jolt, more violent than the last, threw the plane onto its side at a terrifying angle. Passengers cried out in alarm. The tech mogul in 3A was gripping his seat, his face pale, muttering a prayer. The British actress had her face buried in a pillow. The crew, despite the violent conditions, moved with practiced calm. Catherine. Her face a grim mask of determination, walked unsteadily down the aisle, her hands on the seatbacks for balance, checking on passengers. "It's okay, everyone. Stay calm. The captain has this under control. Just keep your seatbelts on." Mark watched her, a sliver of grudging respect piercing through his fear. Her professionalism was absolute, but his focus was on the cockpit door. Behind that door was the man he had belittled, the man whose competence he had openly and racially questioned. And that man was now all that stood between him and a terrifying, watery grave in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The supreme, gut-wrenching irony was not lost on him. Suddenly, an ear-splitting crack, louder than a thunderclap, echoed through the plane, accompanied by a flash of brilliant blue-white light that illuminated the entire cabin. The lights flickered violently and then went out, plunging the plane into absolute darkness save for the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. The roar of the engines changed, one of them sputtering with a series of sickening coughs before falling into an eerie, unnatural silence. They had been struck by lightning. Panic, real and primal, erupted. Screams filled the dark. The plane was now flying on one engine, losing altitude, being tossed about by the storm's fury. The feeling of descent was no longer a subtle drop. It was a constant, terrifying fall. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the cabin in a ghostly, dim glow. Through the chaos, a new voice came over the intercom. It was not the first officer. It was Captain Anderson. His voice was completely devoid of fear. It was a beacon of pure, undiluted command. "This is the captain. We have sustained a lightning strike and have lost power to the number 2 engine. I have disengaged the autopilot. I am flying the aircraft manually. The first officer is working to restart the engine and is declaring an emergency. We have lost altitude, but the aircraft is under my control." He paused, and in that brief silence the only sounds were the howling wind outside and the terrified whimpers of the passengers. "Listen to me," the captain's voice boomed, cutting through the panic. "Your flight attendants are the best in the business. They will be preparing the cabin for a possible emergency landing. You will listen to their instructions. You will follow them without question. Keep your heads down. Stay calm. We are all getting out of this. I will fly this plane. That is my promise to you." There was no room for doubt in his voice. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of intent. Mark Harrington listened, paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like his heart had stopped. The arrogant businessman was gone, stripped away by the raw fear of death. In his place was just a man, a passenger, utterly dependent on the skill and character of the pilot, the same pilot whose character he had judged by the color of his skin. The fury of the sky was immense, But in that moment it was no match for the absolute authority in the voice coming from the cockpit. The cockpit of the Boeing 787 was a maelstrom of controlled chaos. Where the passenger cabin was filled with the sounds of fear, the flight deck was a space of intense, focused action. Red and amber lights flashed across the instrument panels, a constellation of warnings. A cacophony of alarms, the stall warnings, clacker. The engine failure alert, the altitude deviation siren blared in a discordant symphony of crisis. Captain Michael Anderson was a rock in the center of this storm. His hands were firm on the control column, his movements economical and precise. He wasn't just flying the plane, he was feeling it connected to the massive machine through the sensitive feedback of the fly-by-wire system. The 787, crippled and fighting against the violent air currents, felt sluggish and asymmetrical with one engine out. It wanted to yaw, to roll, to surrender to the storm. He would not let it. "Declare Mayday." Ben, he ordered, his voice calm and even, cutting cleanly through the noise. "Squawk 7700. Tell Gander, Oceanic, we've had a lightning strike engine number 2 failure, and we are in an uncontrolled descent." His first officer, Ben Carter, was a decade younger, but his training had been just as rigorous. Despite the sweat beading on his forehead, his hands moved deftly over the controls, his voice steady as he spoke into his headset. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday! Gander, Oceanic. This is Atlantic Skies 815. We have a lightning strike engine number 2 flameout. We are in an uncontrolled descent passing through flight level 290, requesting immediate diversion to nearest suitable airport. Work the checklist, Ben," Captain Anderson commanded, his eyes darting across the primary flight display. Airspeed, altitude, vertical speed, attitude. He processed the data with the speed of a supercomputer. Engine failure and restart. Go. The turbulence was relentless. The aircraft was being slammed by updrafts and downdrafts, making it nearly impossible to maintain a stable attitude. A particularly violent gust threw them into a steep bank. Correcting Anderson said more to himself than to Ben, applying firm pressure to the rudder pedals and controls to bring the wings level. He could feel the immense strain on the airframe. The wings, designed to be flexible, were flapping like a giant bird's. Checklist in progress. Captain Ben responded. His fingers flying across the overhead panel, flipping switches and turning dials in a sequence drilled into him through hundreds of hours in the simulator. APU. Starting. The Auxiliary Power Unit. A small jet engine in the tail of the plane was their lifeline. It could provide essential electrical power now that one of the main engine generators was gone. After a tense few seconds, a green light blinked on. APU is online. We have stable power. Good, Anderson grunted. Now let's try to wake up number 2. Ben initiated the engine restart procedure. He activated the ignition, opened the fuel flow. They waited. The engine coughed a hopeful sign, then fell silent again. The windmilling propeller was not catching. No restart. Captain EGT is not rising. Try it again. We need that engine. We're too heavy to maintain altitude on one, especially in this weather. Outside the cockpit windows, the world was a terrifying vortex of black cloud and searing lightning. It was like flying through hell itself. But inside, the 2 men worked. They were no longer just a captain and a first officer. They were a single entity, a 2-man team against the storm, their years of training and discipline converging into this one critical moment. In the cabin, Mark Harrington was experiencing a profound and terrifying transformation. The emergency landing preparations were in full swing. Flight attendants, Their voices, sharp and commanding, were shouting instructions. "Brace, brace, heads down, stay down, brace." Mark, like everyone else, was bent over his head, pressed against the seat in front of him, his arms wrapped around his head. For the first time in his life, he was not in charge. He was not even a participant. He was a passive object, his fate entirely in the hands of others. The abstract concepts of skill training and character that Captain Anderson had spoken of just hours before were now the most concrete and vital things in the universe. He thought of his life, his deals, his money, his meticulously curated world of prestige and power. All of it was meaningless. In this moment of pure existential terror, all he could think about was the calm, authoritative voice of the pilot. The black pilot. The man he had deemed unworthy to even sit near. The man whose competence he had questioned based on nothing more than the color of his skin. And that man was now fighting tooth and nail against the fury of nature to save him. The shame that had pricked him earlier now returned as a tidal wave, a crushing force that was almost as terrifying as the storm itself. The bigotry he had carried so casually through his life was suddenly revealed for what it was, a grotesque and pathetic delusion. It was a poison he had nurtured in his soul, and now at the potential end of his life, he was choking on it. Back in the cockpit, the second engine restart attempt had failed. "Damn it," Ben muttered. "Forget it." Anderson said, his voice hard as steel. "It's a dead weight. We fly the plane. We have not the one we want. Divert. Where's the nearest strip we can land this thing?" Ben was already on it, his fingers punching coordinates into the flight management system. "St. John's, Newfoundland. It's behind us, but it's the closest. 200 nautical miles. We don't have the altitude to make it." "Then we find it," Anderson said. He pitched the nose of the aircraft down slightly, trading precious altitude for airspeed, trying to escape the worst of the storm cell. "Find me a hole in this mess. I need a path out of this." He was a master of the machine, his mind-body, and the aircraft itself fused into one. Every tremor, every shudder, every groan of the metal was a piece of information he processed and reacted to. He was not just a pilot. He was the brain and heart of the wounded bird, coaxing it, wrestling it, guiding it through the darkness. For the 186 souls behind him, he was their only hope. And for one of those souls in Seat 1A, he was a devastating, life-altering lesson in the true measure of a man. The descent through the storm was an eternity packed into 20 minutes. For Captain Anderson and First Officer Ben Carter, it was a grueling, high-stakes ballet of skill and instinct. For the passengers, it was a terrifying, faith-testing ordeal. "We're out of the worst of it," Anderson announced, his voice tight with concentration. The violent bucking had subsided into a heavy, trembling shudder. They had broken through the bottom layer of the storm cell, but they were now well below a safe cruising altitude and still losing height. Below them was nothing but the cold, black expanse of the North Atlantic. "St. John's is 150 miles out," Ben reported, his voice strained but steady. "They're clearing all traffic. Emergency services are on standby. But Captain, the flight computer projects will be short of the runway by 30 miles. We can't maintain this altitude. They were too heavy with fuel meant for a transatlantic crossing, and the drag from the dead engine was like a deployed anchor. The math was brutal and unforgiving. They were going down. The only question was whether they would reach land first. "Then we shed weight," Anderson said decisively. "Dump fuel. Now." Ben's hands flew to the fuel control panel. "Dumping fuel, Captain." A trail of vaporized jet fuel began to stream from the plane's wings, a desperate offering to the laws of physics. In the cabin, the command to brace had been repeated until it was a hoarse chant. The flight attendants moved like soldiers in a battle zone, checking and rechecking seatbelts, securing anything loose, their faces grim but resolute. Mark Harrington remained in the brace position, his forehead pressed against the plush leather of the seat in front. His whole body trembled, not just from the plane's vibrations, but from the seismic shock to his soul. The arrogant, self-assured man who had boarded this plane in Chicago had been systematically dismantled. First by the pilot's quiet dignity, then by the applause of his fellow passengers, and now by the visceral, gut-wrenching proximity of death. He was listening not just to the roar of the single engine and the groaning of the airframe, but to the memory of Captain Anderson's voice. The skin of the hand guiding the controls is irrelevant. What matters is the steadiness of that hand. He could almost feel that steady hand now, a phantom presence, holding the fragile shell of the aircraft together against the immense forces trying to tear it apart. In his mind's eye, he saw the captain not as a black man, but as a figure of pure competence, a silhouette of grace under unimaginable pressure. The racial caricature he had held in his mind for 54 years shattered into a million pieces, a worthless, ugly relic of a life lived in willful ignorance. What remained was a profound, aching regret. It was a regret so deep it felt like a physical wound. If he died now, his last act on Earth would have been one of blind, stupid hatred. Altitude 8,000 feet. Ben called out in the cockpit. Fuel dump is 50% complete. It's helping. Our descent rate is slowing. Not enough, Anderson said. He could see the coastline on the navigation display, a tantalizingly close line of green. Come on, baby. Just a little further. He spoke to the plane as if it were a living thing, a partner in their struggle. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. The fuel gauge dropped. The altitude unwound relentlessly. 4,000 feet. We can see the lights of the coast. Ben's voice was a mix of hope and terror. The plane broke through the last layer of low-lying cloud. Ahead, through the rain-streaked windscreen, a string of lights glittered in the darkness. It was St. John's. But it was still miles away, and they were perilously low. The ground proximity warning system began to blare its computerized, terrifying chant to rain. Terrain. Pull up! Pull up! I can't pull up, we'll stall, Anderson said through gritted teeth. Gear down! Flaps 20. We're too fast for flaps 20, Ben warned. Do it! Anderson roared his first and only display of raw emotion. The flaps extended with a protesting groan, creating immense drag, but also precious lift. The plane shuddered violently, but the terrifying descent rate slowed just enough. They were coming in hot and heavy, a wounded beast limping home. The runway lights grew larger, rushing towards them at an alarming speed. 1,000 feet, Ben called out. 500, 400. In the cabin, the flight attendants screamed their final command in unison. Brace! 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 Mark Harrington braced, his eyes squeezed shut. He whispered the word, sorry, not to God, but to the universe, to the man in the cockpit, to the person he could have been. With a final, masterful adjustment, Captain Anderson flared the aircraft, lifting the nose just before impact. The landing gear slammed onto the tarmac with a bone-jarring crash. The tires shrieked in protest. One of them blew with a loud bang. The plane veered violently to the left towards the edge of the runway. Anderson wrestled with the rudder pedals, fighting to keep the massive aircraft on the pavement. Sparks flew as a wingtip scraped the ground. With the thunderous roar of the single engine's reverse thrusters and the squeal of emergency brakes, the 70-ton aircraft finally miraculously shuddered to a halt. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the pounding of 187 hearts. Then the cabin erupted. Cheers, sobs, applause, prayers. It was a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated relief. People were hugging strangers, crying on each other's shoulders. The first officer's voice, shaky but triumphant, came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to St. John's." But it was Captain Anderson's voice that followed a moment later, exhausted but clear that everyone would remember. "Cabin crew, please remain seated. Emergency services are approaching the aircraft. We are not out of the woods yet. Please stay calm and await instructions." Mark slowly lifted his head. He was alive. They were all alive. He looked out the window and saw a sea of flashing red and blue lights. Fire trucks and ambulances were racing towards them. He turned his gaze to the front of the cabin, to the armored door of the cockpit. Behind that door was the man who had wrestled them from the jaws of death. A man he had tried to humiliate. A man who had just saved his life. The long fall was over. And in the wreckage of his arrogance, Mark Harrington felt the first unfamiliar glimmer of grace. The evacuation was swift and orderly, the emergency slides deployed with a loud hiss, and passengers leaving all their belongings behind slid down into the rainy, wind-swept night on the Newfoundland coast. The crew, true to their training, were the last to leave, ensuring every passenger was safely off the crippled aircraft. Mark Harrington was one of the last passengers out. As he stumbled onto the tarmac, the cold, salty air a shock to his system, he looked back at the Boeing 787. It was a wounded giant listing to one side, its fuselage streaked with grime, a gaping black hole where one of the tires had blown. Foam from the fire trucks was already blanketing the smoking landing gear. It looked like a casualty of war. The passengers were herded into buses and taken to a private section of the terminal. They were a motley, dazed crew, wrapped in airline blankets, their faces etched with the trauma of the past hour. There were tears and hushed, frantic phone calls to loved ones. But overriding the shock was a profound shared sense of gratitude. They were the survivors of Flight 815, and they knew exactly who they had to thank. When Captain Anderson and First Officer Ben Carter finally entered the terminal, a spontaneous ovation erupted. The crowd of passengers surged forward, wanting to shake their hands, to thank them, to touch the men who had pulled them from the sky. Anderson. His uniform disheveled, his face etched with fatigue, looked overwhelmed. He held up a hand, a gesture of humble thanks. "My crew," he said, his voice hoarse, gesturing to Catherine and the other flight attendants who stood beside him. "They are the heroes. They kept you safe." But the passengers knew. They had all heard his voice, felt his command. He was their captain. Mark stood at the back of the crowd, separate from the celebration. He watched the scene, the adulation being showered upon the pilot, and felt a sense of shame so profound it was a physical weight. He knew he had to do something. He had to face the man he had wronged. He slowly, hesitantly made his way through the crowd. People parted for him, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. They remembered him. He was the other drama of the flight, the ugly prelude to the real crisis. He finally stood before Captain Anderson. The pilot saw him, and his weary face registered a flicker of recognition. The celebratory noise around them seemed to fade away. Captain Mark began, his voice barely a whisper. He had to clear his throat and start again. "Captain Anderson." Anderson just looked at him, his gaze neutral, waiting. I don't know what to say, Mark stammered. The powerful, articulate boardroom negotiator was gone, replaced by a fumbling, humbled man. What I did, back on the plane, there is no excuse. It was vile. It was ignorant. It was unforgivable. He took a shaky breath, forcing himself to meet the captain's eyes. You are the most professional, the most competent, the bravest man I have ever met. You saved my life. You saved all our lives. And I am so deeply, profoundly sorry for what I said, for what I am. Captain Anderson listened, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he gave a slow, tired nod. Apology accepted, Mr. Harrington. He said, his voice quiet. Fear has a way of clarifying things. I hope you remember this clarity when the fear is gone. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more profound. It was an acknowledgement, a challenge. It was a quiet closing of a door. With that, the captain turned to speak with an airport official, the conversation over. Mark stood there, feeling the full weight of that final judgment. It was not a punishment, but a life sentence of self-reflection, that he thought was his karma. But he was wrong. The hard karma, the kind the universe delivers with cold, bureaucratic precision, was still waiting for him. As the passengers were being processed by Customs and Immigration, 2 uniformed officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police approached Mark. They were accompanied by a stern-looking airline security official, Mr. Mark Harrington, one of the officers asked. Yes, Mark replied, confused. Sir, we need you to come with us. What is this about, Mark? Asked a flicker of his old arrogance returning. The airline official stepped forward, holding a tablet. Mr. Harrington, during the boarding of Flight 815, you created a disturbance. You verbally abused and racially harassed the captain. You initially refused to comply with the lawful instructions of a flight crew member, causing a delay in departure. Under international aviation law, this constitutes interference with a flight crew, a serious federal offense. Mark stared in disbelief. But that was hours ago. We nearly died. That is precisely the point, sir, the RCMP officer said, his voice cold. The crew you interfered with was about to face a life-threatening emergency. The stress and distraction you caused immediately prior to that crisis is considered an aggravating factor. The airline is pressing charges. You are being detained pending an investigation. It was like a punch to the gut. The tech mogul who had been standing nearby overheard the exchange and didn't even try to hide his smirk. The British actress shook her head with a look of disgust. Word spread through the remaining passengers like wildfire. As the officers escorted a stunned, pale Mark Harrington away, he caught one last glimpse of Captain Anderson. The pilot was standing with his crew, ensuring they were all cared for. He wasn't looking at Mark. He wasn't gloating. He was simply doing his job, his duty complete. Mark Harrington had arrived in Chicago as a titan of industry, a man who believed he was above everyone else. He was leaving St. John's in the custody of law enforcement, his multi-million-dollar deal in London in ashes. His reputation destroyed, his life irrevocably changed. He had refused to sit next to a black pilot only to have that pilot save his life, and in doing so expose the utter bankruptcy of his own soul. He had learned in the most terrifying way imaginable that gravity, both physical and moral, has a way of bringing everyone back down to earth. The story of Flight 815 isn't just about a mid-air emergency. It's a powerful reminder that our true character is revealed not in calm skies, but in the heart of the storm. It shows us that prejudice is a poison that blinds us to the humanity and heroism in others, and that true authority comes not from a title or a bank account, but from courage, skill, and grace under pressure. Captain Anderson's steady hand saved 187 lives, while Mark Harrington's hateful arrogance led him to his own downfall. This is more than just a story of karma. It's a testament to the fact that in the end, we are all passengers on this journey together, and decency is the only baggage worth carrying. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that matter.